Right now, we are setting the stage for a massive legal shift, one that completely tore down a 20-year precedent on indefinite immigration detention here in Australia. For decades, the system operated under one set of rules, right? But a monumental high court ruling just turned that entire system upside down. We're going to look at the mechanics of how the law actually works, what happens when the government gets it spectacularly wrong, and the absolute constitutional showdown that followed.
So it brings up a really high-stakes question. Can the government escape paying for a 20-year mistake? This is your ultimate David versus Goliath legal clash. Think about it. When the government detains people under a law that is later found to be completely invalid, do they just get to say, whoops, well, we thought it was legal at the time, or do they actually have to pay for the consequences? The answer to that has triggered sheer panic in the executive branch and a whole lot of hope for hundreds of former detainees.
Okay, let's dive into this. First, we'll trace that two-decade mistake, then examine the specific unlawful detention that sparked the whole battle. After that, we'll break down the government's novel defense, hit a massive constitutional roadblock, and finally, explore the very expensive fallout.
Section 1. A two-decade mistake.
To really grasp the present crisis, we have to rewind. Because for nearly 20 years, the Commonwealth operated under the assumption that it could hold unlawful non-citizens indefinitely. This whole idea was built on a 2004 High Court case called Al-Kateb. That ruling basically said the government could detain people even if there was literally no realistic prospect of them ever being deported. But then, in 2023, everything changed. A landmark decision known as the NZY case reopened and explicitly overruled that 2004 ruling on constitutional grounds. So suddenly, the government realizes it's been relying on an invalid law for 2 decades. And that brings us straight to 2024 and 2025, with the Abdel Hadi case, which is tackling the massive civil liability fallout of that realization.
Yeah, to understand the financial stakes here, we need to wrap our heads around a crucial legal term, the tort of false imprisonment. Let's de-jargonize this for a second. A tort is just a civil wrong. False imprisonment basically means you get compensation if anyone, and yes, that includes a government official, detains you without lawful authority. Because the NZYQ case established that detaining someone with zero prospect of deportation was unlawful, the Commonwealth suddenly faced potential civil liability for false imprisonment for anyone they held under those specific conditions. It's huge.
Section 2. The unlawful detention.
Now, what's really interesting is the human element that triggered this legal storm. Let's look at the case of Safwat Abdel Hadi. His specific circumstances created the perfect legal storm. He came to Australia from Austria back in 1997. Fast forward to 2017, his visa gets canceled on character grounds, which leads to his detention. But here is the critical complication. Abdel Hadi actually developed a health condition that made it highly dangerous for him to fly. Because of this, the Commonwealth eventually had to accept that by at least July 2022, there was zero foreseeable prospect of deporting him. Following that NZYQ ruling, he was finally released in 2024, and the court ruled his detention for that period had indeed been unlawful.
Section 3. The government's defense. Facing a potentially massive payout, the government tried to play a really novel get-out-of-jail-free card. Clearly contrasting the two sides makes this fascinating. The government basically argued, hey, we relied on a valid law at the time. The 2004 ruling said we could do this, so our officials should have immunity, right? But the plaintiff fired back with a core reality of judicial power. See, when the High Court overrules a past decision, it doesn't just change the law going forward. It declares what the law in truth is and what it always has been. Therefore, that overruled law was always invalid, meaning the detention was always unlawful.
The government actually tried to lean on a precedent set in a case called Stratford, where judicial officers like, say, sheriffs executing court orders are granted immunity just to maintain the independence of the courts. But the plaintiff argued, no way, you cannot extend this to executive officers who are simply following legislative commands. Protecting judges so they can rule without fear, well, that's a pillar of the justice system. But granting blanket immunity to the executive branch for enforcing unconstitutional statutes, that directly undermines the rule of law.
Section 4. The constitutional roadblock.
Enter the intervener, a party known as BOE 21, who is a stateless Somalian refugee facing a very similar situation of unlawful detention, was granted leave to intervene in the case. And BOE 21's legal team brought an incredibly powerful constitutional argument directly to the High Court to stop the government from creating this new legal immunity. So the crucial point is this foundational legal doctrine known as the non-circuity principle. It essentially states you cannot do indirectly what the Constitution forbids directly. The intervener pointed straight to Section 51XXI of the Constitution. That section says the government cannot acquire property, which includes the benefit of defeating a legal claim, except on just terms. If the government just passed a law canceling everyone's right to sue them for false imprisonment, well, that would be completely unconstitutional. Therefore, the intervener argued the government cannot ask the common law to invent a loophole to do that exact same thing indirectly.
And the High Court agreed, delivering an absolute knockout blow to the government's defense. 3 judges explicitly stated that transforming the government's obligation to obey the law into a blanket immunity simply because they thought they were acting within their power, quote, would amount to an inversion, if not a perversion of constitutional principle. They firmly held that the government can only interfere with human liberty where it actually has the legal authority to do so, no exceptions.
And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly high stakes of this case. You can hear it in the passionate language from the intervener's submission. They argued that giving the government this defense would be, quote, mocking the Constitution by substituting executive for legislative interference with freedom. The Constitution is a strict boundary, and the courts absolutely refuse to let the executive branch bypass those limits just to avoid a hefty bill.
Section 5. The expensive fallout.
Let's look at the sheer scale of this domino effect. 350. Reports suggest that around 350 people were released from immigration detention right in the wake of the NZY2 finding. Now, while it's unclear exactly how many of those 350 were detained unlawfully under the specific conditions we just discussed, the door is now wide open for potentially hundreds of claims against the Commonwealth.
Let's move to how this builds into practical consequences. The scope of liability here is vast. Compensation for false imprisonment can range from nominal damages, like a single dollar if the detention was essentially inevitable anyway, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending entirely on the length and the impact of the detention on the individual. Because litigating hundreds of cases is exhausting and ridiculously expensive, the government might choose to just quietly settle these claims out of court. Ultimately, this serves as a highly expensive lesson on the inherent risks of passing broad executive detention powers without incredibly careful legislation.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. What is the true cost to the government for passing sweeping executive detention powers without careful legislation? This case proves that when the delicate balance between executive power, human liberty, and strict constitutional boundaries is tested, the bill always comes due. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics of the systems around you.